has regained his poise. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Cronkite.
Jim, you are a tough act to follow. You're a tough act to compete against, and you're a worse one to follow. It is true that I was speechless 20 years ago, and I guess there are more people tonight who wish that were so tonight than even recognize the fact 20 years ago. Keynote speeches shouldn't come at this hour of the night. I think it should be a postscript, probably, to all the wonderful things have been said here tonight about the Apollo program, about what it meant, what it is. Was I speechless? Was I speechless? I thought that maybe I was having the opportunity tonight, 20 years later, that I've been looking for all those years, and that's to finally tell a few people who weren't able to watch the broadcast, the CBS broadcast, that is, that, with apologies, Jim, I would be able to tell them what I said that night. Now I learn that in the seclusion of the chamber, the astronauts themselves watched the tape, and so I can assume that maybe some of the rest of you who were rather busy at that moment watched the tapes as well. But for those of you who didn't, you may want to take paper and pencil, by the way, for these were immortal words. When I did find my voice, they should be really placed on Mars when we get there, I suppose, because, well, they were momentous. What I said was, I quote this directly, "Oh boy." Oh, actually, I had more. I gathered my wits at that point and went right ahead. My next word was, whew. Followed by, again, for emphasis, clearly planned, boy. But I wasn't the only one. I looked over at Wally Schirra sitting next to me, and he had tears rolling down his cheeks, as I did down mine. I almost got that same feeling tonight. What a magnificent job you did, Jim, and all of you, in putting that presentation together. Thrilling, thrilling. The dinner was too, by the way, whoever did that. Beautiful, and the decorations, the whole thing. And what 20 years ago, it doesn't seem possible, but what a reunion. Viewed by posterity, what I said may lack the resonance, of course, of that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, but my reaction, I think, was made up in feeling for probably what it lacked in content. I was overcome. Here I was, a professional reporter, supposedly, a professional communicator, and there I was, speechless. The really remarkable thing, of course, is that I'd had just as long to prepare for that moment as the whole Apollo program had. Look what the Apollo program did, and look what I was able to come up with. But you know, I'm pretty positive that everybody felt that same inexpressible high that had caught hold of me. And not just Americans, of course, but the multitudes all around the globe. In fact, of all the millions of earthlings who knew men were finally standing on the moon, the least spaced out probably were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. But what thrills they gave us, and what memories. We could recount them, of course, here tonight, and we have been doing some of that for hours, and indeed we'll continue to do it forevermore. The memory of Buzz Aldrin joking about not locking himself out as he climbed out of the hatch and into immortality, of course. Both Neil and Buzz describing their initial impressions that seemed to be so different at the moment and gave it human dimension. To Neil, it was stark beauty. To Buzz, magnificent desolation. The deployment of the plaque, saying, as we noted here, from here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. The American flag and the phone call from President Nixon in which Neil said, It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but men of peace of all nations with an interest and curiosity and a vision for the future. 20 years later, I think we're thankful still that from the beginning, the Apollo 11 astronauts saw their mission not only as an achievement of the United States, but most importantly, as a milestone in the history of man. Can you pass me some of that? Here, I'll borrow yours. As Winston Churchill used to say, water, except he lied. Those thoughts, of course, of peace, of man making this venture for all men, those thoughts were picked up by others, repeated by many of the space philosophers of the time. With us in our studio were two great men of vision, Arthur Clarke and Robert Heinlein. Heinlein was dead certain that what we had just seen was only the start of man's space exploration, of trips to all our sister planets, even to other stars. And Clarke said, and when they do go out, just as when they came to this country, they'll forget their original nationalities. We're going to see them going out into space as nations which will develop new ideas. I suppose that underneath whatever veneer I have picked up in half a century or so as a newsman, cynical veneer, I'm afraid, in many ways, I'm still sort of a simple gee whiz sort of a guy. I believe in progress. I believe that man can solve his problems and better his condition on this planet if he puts his mind to it. I have this faith in technology and science and engineering. I feel that they can help us move mountains if we keep them under control. I think our country ought to stand for something, quite a lot of good things, and when it does, I'm proud of it, proud of being an American. And I guess that puts me in our country's mainstream. And as a member of the mainstream, the epic flight of Apollo 2 was my kind of story. And it couldn't have happened at a better time for America and for us Americans. Most of us will remember that 1969 wasn't the best of times. The war in Vietnam was tearing us apart. There were peace talks, of course, stumbling along, as I remember, in Paris inconclusively. The U.S. contingent in Vietnam was being reduced, but the bloodshed continued. Sometime around April, the number of American dead passed the total in the Korean War, 33,000. It was to go quite a bit higher. Anti-war demonstrations routinely brought out tens of thousands of people. Some of them threw rocks at policemen and National Guardsmen, and they naturally responded. If the burning of one American flag upsets us today to the point of amending the Constitution, we might remember that in 1969, flag burning was a standard operating procedure in some quarters of our country. Now, Vietnam wasn't the only thing dividing the country. After years of heroic efforts to win the ordinary rights of citizenship, black leaders were giving way to new, angrier voices who spoke of withdrawal instead of integration. Some armed themselves and even shot it out with the police. And so many of our better students had little time or inclination to study anything, expanding all their energies instead in occupying administration buildings and closing down campuses and even bombing laboratories, confronting all authority figures, whether in the university or on the police force or wherever, challenging the very scholarship they supposedly were there to further, demanding it be replaced by something more relevant, whatever in the devil that was. There are issues that divide us today, of course. There undoubtedly were issues that divided men when they first banded together with clubs and spears to hunt game. But there was a special ugliness about the late 60s, giving rise to even fear that civilization itself, at least American civilization, was in mortal danger. We certainly were losing faith in ourselves. And in this dismal setting, what a breath of fresh air the Apollo project was. It was grounded in optimism and predicated on teamwork. It honored an old American tradition, rolling back an unexplored frontier. And while there were those who saw our moon mission as primarily one to beat the Russians, or saw in it primarily a military objective to dominate space from a lunar platform, the motive that most Americans took to their hearts was a much more splendid one. Simply put, to explore the unknown, to expand the parameters of human knowledge. My colleague Eric Sevareid summed up both sides of the argument on the air that night before Apollo 2 was launched. I must say that until that time, Eric, to me, it seemed generally contemptuous of the space program. But the grandeur of the occasion got to him down there at the Cape. I felt that he blossomed right there before my very eyes. Throughout our coverage, he was as eloquent and thought-provoking as only Eric Sevareid could be. So, with your permission, I'm going to quote him with some words that are particularly pertinent today and are far more eloquent, I must say, than, oh boy, whoo. Eric said, "The core of the argument is philosophical, almost religious, and concerns the nature of man and his society. There are men here passionately convinced that we cannot plan our opportunities, but must take them at the tide when they come, that without new frontiers always beckoning, an energetic people rusts and corrodes, that space is not only the cutting edge for science today, but a moral substitute for war that could give the quarreling human race some sense of common identity, of brotherhood. And there are men convinced with equal passion that this adventure, however majestic its drama, is only one more act of escape, that it is man once again running away from himself and his real needs, that we're approaching the bright side of the moon with the dark side of ourselves, with chauvinism, competitive aggression, and that the chief uses of space will be military in the end. We do know that history has never proceeded by a rational plan. Not even science knows what it is doing much beyond the immediate experiment. We know that the human brain will soon know more about the composition of the moon than it knows about the human brain. We will know why the moon is what and where it is before we know why human beings do what they do. We are still closer to our animal origins than to any millennium in peace. It is possible that the divine spark in man will consume him in flames, that the big brain will prove our ultimate flaw, like the dinosaur's big body, that the metal plaque Armstrong and Aldrin expect to place on the moon will become man's epitaph. But the future has never revealed itself. It is made step by step, moment by moment. The next great moment is now at hand." Beautiful words from Eric Sevareid. Well, the next great moment of which Eric spoke, of course, that day was the Eagle departure and landing then on the moon. But how appropriate his remarks are now, 20 years later, as we ponder the nature of our next great moment. Some people today seem to have the idea that the moon landing itself has been demeaned because we have not met in these ensuing 20 years all the optimistic hopes for our space future that were voiced in the euphoria of Apollo 11 success. Well, we've not met all those promises, of course, and who knows that better than all of us here. We have flown a successful, reusable shuttle and thus taken the first step toward an orbiting space station. But we've not established a space colony, nor a base on the moon, nor gone to distant planets. In fact, we have met almost none of the spoken promises of 2 decades ago. This is not the way we would have liked it, but that's the way it has been. Disputed priorities within the space program, unclear objectives, presidential disinterest, inadequate funding, all have contributed to the American doldrums in space exploration. Discouragement is to be expected among those who have given so much to the program and are impatient for further great adventures within their lifetimes. And it's a shame that through a sense of inactivity in the space program, public enthusiasm has been permitted to wane. But from the broad perspective of history, these years since the Apollo missions have been but a flicker of an eyelid. They do not mark a cessation of man's exploration of space, but only a hiatus, and historically speaking, a very brief hiatus at that. The pause in no possible way should be considered a reflection of any kind on Apollo, or more specifically on all of us, of our pioneering space exploration, a generation who dreamed and spoke so enthusiastically of the future on that day of triumph 20 years ago. The accomplishments of all of you who planned the missions, who built the spacecraft, who made the difficult decisions in mission control, who flew beyond where man had ever been, who flew the first great steps out there. Let's not forget that Borman, Lovell, Anders, Stafford, Cernan, Young all went to the moon too. They helped show the way. All the accomplishments of all of you did pave the way to the future, no matter when the next person takes that great step for mankind. And by the way, mentioning John Young, if you can tell a personal reminiscence story, I can, doggone it. Not as charmingly, of course, Jim, but I got to tell you once, I was telling Mr. Cohen, that John Young took me for a ride in the shuttle simulator out here at the Johnson Space Center, and we'd landed thing, and the voice control came and said, "John, we've got an indication of a fire in here." And John turned to me and said, "What in the world are they doing? We're just, taking a few simulator rides here. I don't even have my books. We've never practiced fire on the run out like this." Just with that, they came in again and said, John, we've got an indication of a fire in here." And he said, I know, I'm working on the problem." And he said, "Oh, not in the simulator program, here in the building. Get the hell out of there." Well, there's going to be more delay in our space program. We're in a kind of a happy 24-hour euphoria right now after the events in Washington yesterday. But we can't expect that we're going to immediately be able to build the machines and start out toward Mars, of course. Nobody realistically believes that. One thing that has happened since Apollo is a change in the financial fortunes of our country, of course. The next steps are going to have to compete for shrunken resources with urgent social programs to house the homeless, educate the underprivileged illiterate, protect the environment, reestablish the competitiveness of American industry. But need I go on? There are some who wish that some of the vast expenditures for the military utilization of space could be reappropriated for the peaceful exploration of space, even as the vision was projected by the words of Neil and Buzz and on that plaque that they left on the moon. And then perhaps we could share the vast expenses of further exploration with the Soviet Union and other nations, and we could get on with more expeditiously with the challenges ahead of all mankind. Perhaps out there we could escape the artificial national rivalries that stifle us in our Earth environment. But however it's done, surely imaginative leadership in our space program will win out. We are celebrating tonight the supreme technological achievement of our 20th century, a century of great inventions and of scientific progress. Why, in the lifetime of most of us here, we've plunged into at least 6 engineering, scientific, technological eras, any one of which could qualify as a whole age of man. The nuclear age, the computer age, the petrochemical age, the telecommunications age, the DNA age, and of course, the space age. And in our 20th century, we also experienced 2 great world wars that saw the destruction of great cities and irreplaceable works of art and cost millions of lives. And we watched empires wither and others grow. 400 years from now, in the year 2389, the children of our descendants living in space stations and on the moon and perhaps on other planets will be gathering in their schoolrooms or at their telecomputers or whatnot And if future educational systems overcome our present aversion to teaching history, they'll be spending a little time learning about the 20th century. We can't even be sure exactly what those descendants of ours are going to look like. We know how natural selection has increased the size of the human body in the last 400 years. Think what the influence of an artificial space environment plus man's manipulative capacity with DNA discoveries might do to future humans. At any rate, we should be fairly certain that they'll somehow absorb their history, maybe even through thought transference or whatnot. Maybe that's the only way to teach children history. But of one thing we can be even more certain. The one event of the 20th century, the one event whose date those spacelings of the 24th century will be asked to memorize, will be Apollo 11's landing on the moon, July 20, 1969. That was the day, way back then, their teachers will tell them, when a primitive spacecraft with dangerously explosive fuel and great tanks that left the Earth in a frightening, although controlled explosion, finally, after an incredibly long voyage of more than 2 days, landed on the moon, and two men in great cumbersome costumes got out while the whole world held its collective breath. It was so dangerous a mission, it was thought. And children, they'll be told, that began the age of space exploration. That led to the creation of our home here on Colony 12, or wherever. And they'll learn that, incredible as it will seem then, in 2389, people on Earth actually argued about whether it was worth spending the money to send those early explorers into space. Well, doesn't it all sound kind of familiar? Queen Isabella's precarious funding of Columbus, a little grumbling in the royal court. After all, despite the great political movements and even the birth of the Renaissance, what is the one date we all remember from the 15th century? Of course, October 12th, 1492. Most of our century's great events will be but asterisks in future history books compared to man escaping Earth and landing on a distant orb. And you were there. Even those of us who participated even those of us who participated only as reporters can take great satisfaction in having been present at the beginning of a great new age of man. So Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, the thousands of others who made possible and supported you in your great adventure. May I close with words familiar to most of you, Shakespeare's Henry V, as he rallied his outmanned forces to battle the French at Agincourt. Gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhood cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. Thank you, and God bless.
We're very near the end of this evening. One more speaker. I want to thank the organizers of this celebration for inviting me to be here as a part of this evening. And I want to add my congratulations to Neil and Buzz and Mike for their outstanding achievements on Apollo 11 and to all the men and women who made it possible. I count the years that I covered the Apollo program among the happiest and most rewarding of my life, and I thank everyone involved for that great adventure and for this wonderful evening. 3 weeks ago today, Richard Truly retired as a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. His retirement lasted exactly 24 hours. The next day, he became the 8th Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the first astronaut to hold that job. In the 3.5 years prior to this month, Dick had successfully led the effort to get the shuttle back flying again, and this year he was awarded both the Collier and the Goddard trophies. Dick was the pilot on the STS-2, the Columbia, first manned spacecraft ever reflown in space. He was the commander of the STS-8, the Challenger, in the first night launch and night landing in the shuttle program, and prior to joining NASA, Dick was a Navy fighter pilot with more than 7,500 hours of jet time. Did you ever stop and think about that? If you fly a jet 500 miles an hour on an average, it means that Dick truly has flown 3,757,000 miles. Furthermore, if you consider that he was born about 200 miles from here over in Fayette, Mississippi, which is just a little bit south of Panther Swamp, it means that he sure came a long way to get here tonight. Dick's got the Distinguished Service Medal, 2 Legions of Merit, the Navy Distinguished Flying Cross, Doolittle Award, Harmon Trophy, among other achievements. But his friends here in Houston tell me that he's proudest of the fact that he is president for life of the Ace Moving Company. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Richard Truly.
America's space program is about leadership, and leadership, in my opinion, is about presidents. Like President Kennedy standing on the steps of Rice Stadium behind me, and yesterday President Bush on the steps of the the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It's late tonight. It's been a long evening and a wonderful one. And in saying goodnight, I can't top the words of my boss. The White House, July 20th, yesterday, 1989. Barbara and I are delighted to send our warmest greetings to everyone gathered in Houston to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the first Apollo lunar landing. With the success of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin fulfilled the dreams of Americans and of people throughout the world and throughout the ages, the exploration of the moon. It is fitting, therefore, that we recall our pride in that remarkable and historic achievement and honor the thousands of men and women of NASA and the aerospace community who made it possible. However, the anniversary of the moon landing is not merely a time to commemorate the past. It is an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to the future of America's space program. Whether pursuing the development of space station Freedom, returning to the moon, or reaching out to Mars, the exploration of space, our last great frontier, poses technical challenges for the United States and offers immense rewards for mankind. I know that NASA and America are up to the challenge. As we work to ensure that our nation's space program remains second to none, Barbara joins me in sending our best wishes for an enjoyable anniversary celebration. May God bless you, George Bush. Thank you.
It was my understanding that Dick was going to close the evening off. That's it for tonight. Enjoy yourself. Thank you for coming. Dancing for those of you who still have the stamina. Thank you and good night.